In the imagination of the Middle Ages, the law reached further than we might believe possible. It did not stop at city gates, nor did it end with the hands of men. In a time when the sacred and the earthly were woven into a single fabric, justice was thought to govern not only people, but the beasts that shared their world. And so it happened that animals were summoned before courts of law, a pig that injured a villager, a dog that attacked a traveler, rats that consumed grain, insects that swarmed across a harvest. All could be treated as if they had broken society's fragile contract and were now called to account for their actions. To us, the idea feels absurd, like a carnival of superstition, but to medieval minds, it made a profound kind of sense. The world was seen as one vast ladder of being, with angels above, stones below, and every living thing placed somewhere in between. If humans bore responsibility before God and the law, then the creatures that lived alongside them surely shared in that same order. When a pig ran wild or locusts ravaged the fields, it was not merely misfortune, it was disorder, and disorder demanded an answer. Communities, small and large, feared chaos in every form. Famine, plague, or fire could tear through lives overnight. The people had few tools to control such forces, but they had ritual and they had law. To put an animal on trial was to give fear a name, to bind calamity within the walls of a courtroom. What had seemed senseless could now be confronted. What had been grief could now be spoken of in terms of guilt, responsibility, and judgment. The trials followed familiar forms. Summonses were issued. Hearings were scheduled. Clerks copied the charges in ink. Witnesses swore oaths to tell the truth. The accused might even be appointed a lawyer who argued, sometimes brilliantly, that the creature had acted by instinct rather than malice, or that its keeper should be blamed instead. These details remind us that for the people of the time, these cases were not jokes. They were handled with the same solemnity as any other matter of justice. When punishments came, they were carried out with ceremony. Some animals were condemned to death, a public act designed not to satisfy cruelty, but to teach responsibility. If a beast could not be controlled, it was banished from the community in the most visible way possible. Other times, especially when whole populations of pests were the accused, the punishment was symbolic. Priests might pronounce excommunication on the rats, or curse the caterpillars that stripped the vines, driving them out with the authority of the church. Each trial was at heart a drama. It offered reassurance in a world where safety could vanish overnight. By declaring that even animals were subject to the law, society affirmed that no misfortune was beyond the reach of order. Everything had its place. Every act could be answered. Every wrong, however strange, could be spoken into balance again. To the modern reader, these records feel like curiosities, odd fragments of a distant age. But to medieval villagers and townsfolk, they were deadly serious. They reveal how people tried to tame the uncertainty of life, not only with prayer, but with procedure. They show a world that sought to bind together heaven, earth, and beast under the same chain of responsibility. So when we hear of pigs in chains, rats being summoned to court, or insects facing the wrath of priests, we are not only hearing about superstition, we are glimpsing the medieval desire to control the uncontrollable, to frame the chaos of nature inside the solemn rituals of justice. It is a reminder that though the centuries have passed, humanity still reaches for the same thing, the hope that even in the face of disaster, order can be restored.
The courtroom is small, but everything inside it is heavy with meaning. A bench worn smooth by judgment, candles breathing smoke into rafters, a clerk bending over a ledger, patient as a metronome. Villagers stand along the walls, hats in hand, because today the accused is not a man, but a creature that shares their streets. Ceremony steadies the room. The judge enters, oaths are sworn, and the law, ancient, deliberate, opens its mouth to speak. First come the charges, read as plainly as if the defendant could understand them. Injury, trespass, the disturbance of the peace. The phrasing is careful. Words create boundaries. Boundaries keep fear at bay. A witness steps forward and tells the story once, then again, no detail too small. Where did the gate fail? Who saw the first sign of trouble? Did the owner take ordinary care? Each question converts the chaos of an accident into the clean lines of procedure. Then, astonishing to us but natural to them, a lawyer rises to defend the animal. He does not mock the court, nor does the court mock him. He argues that instinct is not malice, that a beast cannot form the guilty mind the law demands. He points to the keeper. Was the pen too low? The tether frayed? The lane left open? He cites precedents from neighboring towns, cases where failure of custody transferred blame from the creature to the man who profited by it. Sometimes he invokes mercy, not as sentiment, but as policy. Justice should correct the living, not merely end a life. Procedure extends even to summons. If the accused cannot be safely brought, notices are posted where the law imagines it might reside: the stable door, the commons, the edge of the field. For swarming pests, the court orders a proclamation from the church steps, granting a formal grace period to depart. Absurd? Perhaps. But the point is not that a rat reads a writ. The point is that the community sees the writ, and by seeing assents to a common story about order and consequence. Jurisdiction is argued with the same sober care. Does this court have authority if the harm crossed the boundary between parish and manor? If the animal belonged to a traveling trader, can the town hold him to account, or must a higher court speak? These questions are not technicalities to be endured. They are the skeleton of trust. People accept a verdict because they watch the law prove its right to deliver one. When the verdict arrives, it is spoken without flourish. If the court finds the keeper negligent, fines follow, and orders: taller fences, stronger gates, tethering by night, warnings posted at the market. If the single animal is judged irredeemably dangerous, the sentence is removal from the community, carried out in public not to delight the crowd, but to instruct it. When whole species stand accused, the punishment turns symbolic: banishment by proclamation, boundaries drawn in prayer and ink, a promise that the town will not surrender its harvest without reply. Every gesture is theater with a purpose: the advocate's solemn bow, the clerk's patient pen, the judge's measured tone. These are the ropes and pulleys that lift grief out of rumor and set it on a visible stage. The audience leaves with tasks, not just feelings: mend the latch, mind the lane, keep beasts from wandering among the washing in the play. In this sense, the defendant, mute, bewildered, has served the community by becoming the center of a lesson everyone can see. The ledger closes on a line of neat script. That line is the true sentence, because it endures. It will be read in winter when memory blurs. It will be shown to a neighbor who doubts the rule. It will be copied for a distant magistrate who asks how this town keeps order. The record is not merely a list of punishments. It is a map of responsibilities, drawn where human life touches animal life without clear borders. From our distance, we may imagine only strangeness here, but the medieval courtroom of beasts was less a hall of cruelty than a workshop for civic repair. It took shock and turned it into instruction, turned rumor into testimony, turned anger toward the places where change could actually happen: gates, tethers, habits, care. In that transformation lies the secret of the ritual's power. The law did not tame the animal world, it tamed the human response to it, and for a people living close to hoof and hunger, that was justice enough. The crimes of medieval animals were not always committed by a single beast in a village lane. Sometimes the culprits arrived in multitudes. Rats swarmed through the granaries, leaving only husks. Caterpillars and locusts descended on the vineyards, stripping the vines bare. These were not solitary offenses, but disasters that threatened whole communities. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming forces, people of the Middle Ages turned to the familiar rituals of law and faith. If one pig could be summoned to trial, why not an entire colony of vermin? Petitions were drawn up, detailing the destruction in sober words: grain spoiled, vines blackened, bread scarce. The court acknowledged the suffering of the people, and writs were issued summoning the culprits. Yes, summons for rats, for insects, for creatures that could not possibly read or appear. But to the medieval mind, this was not folly. The act of writing and posting the notice was itself a declaration. The town will not endure silent ruin. It will demand order, even from the smallest of God's creatures. On the appointed day, the clergy stood beside the magistrates. From the pulpit, the creatures were addressed by name: rats of the parish, worms of the vineyard, swarms of the field. They were given a chance to withdraw, a grace period in which to vacate the lands of the faithful. It was a ritual echo of God's own justice: mercy first, punishment after. If the pests failed to comply, the Church pronounced the ultimate sanction: excommunication. This was no light matter. To be excommunicated was to be cut off from the blessings of the Church, denied grace and shelter. That such a sentence could be directed at animals tells us less about theology than about psychology. For communities under siege, the ritual gave form to desperation. With words of authority, priests drew invisible lines around the village. Here is sanctuary, here is law, and beyond it you must go. Processions often carried the sentence outward into the fields. Clerics sprinkled holy water at the borders, while parishioners traced crosses in the soil. Psalms were chanted as though they were both prayer and spell, designed to drive the invaders back. Some towns even designated alternate lands for the creatures, declaring distant woods or barren fields to be their rightful domain. This curious compromise, banishing pests yet granting them territory, reveals the medieval desire not to destroy creation, but to set it back into balance. The seriousness with which these rituals were carried out is striking. Advocates sometimes defended the accused species, arguing that they too were God's creatures and deserved their place in the world. If a plague of rats could not be removed, the defense might plead for safe passage, claiming the journey to court was too dangerous, as cats and hawks lurked on the roads. It was an odd kind of mercy, but mercy nonetheless, framed in the language of law. Did these sentences work? That depended on what one believed. Crops sometimes recovered, plagues of vermin sometimes passed, and the people credited their prayers, their trials, their holy proclamations. Even if nothing changed in the fields, the act of judgment changed the community. It united them in action, gave them hope that they had not been abandoned, and allowed them to believe that they had pushed back against chaos with words as sharp as any sword. To us, the image of rats being summoned to court or caterpillars formally excommunicated is almost comical. Yet beneath the strangeness lies something profoundly human. When confronted with forces beyond control, the people of the Middle Ages responded with ritual. They wrapped fear in the robes of ceremony, turned disaster into a case with plaintiff and defendant, and sought protection through the only system they trusted, the law of man and the law of God, joined together in a single voice. And so in fields once stripped bare, peasants believed they saw justice carried on the wind, not always in the flight of the rats, nor in the sudden vanishing of insects,
but in the quiet conviction that their cries had been heard, their world had meaning, and the law could still draw a circle of order against the darkness of misfortune.
Among all the strange trials of the Middle Ages, one tale stands above the rest, retold in chronicles and whispered in curiosity even centuries later: the trial of the pig of Falaise. It was the year 1386 in the bustling town of Normandy. The streets were narrow, the houses built of timber and stone, their upper stories leaning toward one another like conspirators. Livestock roamed freely through the alleys, living as close to humans as any pet today. In such a world, the boundary between man and beast blurred daily, and sometimes, disastrously, it broke. A tragedy struck when a pig, wandering loose, attacked and killed a small child. In a community where children were seen as blessings and survival was already precarious, this was more than a personal grief. It was an affront to order itself. The people demanded justice, and in their world, justice meant a trial. The animal was seized, chained, and brought before the court as though it were a criminal capable of intent. The case was heard with all the solemnity of human justice. Witnesses gave their accounts. Clerks recorded the proceedings. The charges were read aloud. A crime against the innocent, a breach of peace, a challenge to the authority of both law and community. And though the pig could not speak, it had been given its day in court, an echo of the belief that all creatures fell under God's law. The verdict was swift. The pig was found guilty. But it was not enough to simply carry out the sentence. Justice demanded spectacle. The people needed to see that the crime had been answered, that their world had been set back into balance. And so the authorities staged an execution like no other. The pig was dressed in human clothes, a jacket, gloves, trousers, garments meant not as mockery, but as symbolism. The message was clear. This creature had crossed into human territory, and it would be treated as such in punishment. The square of Falaise filled with townspeople. Parents brought children. Artisans left their shops. Clergy and officials stood in solemn ranks. They gathered not out of cruelty, but out of fear and fascination. In their eyes, this was no farce. This was the restoration of order. The execution was carried out in public, and chroniclers note that the crowd observed it as they would any other solemn sentence, quiet, watchful, convinced that justice had been done. For the townspeople, the meaning was plain. The case was not just about the pig. It was about the duties of owners who must keep their animals under control. It was about the safety of children, the responsibility of the community, the proof that law was stronger than chaos. By clothing the animal in human dress, the town turned punishment into a parable. When beasts transgress, they will be treated as men, judged and condemned in the same square. The record of this trial spread beyond Falaise. It was copied into chronicles, cited by later historians, and became one of the most famous examples of medieval animal justice. To us, the image is grotesque, absurd, even comic. But to the people who witnessed it, the moment was deadly serious. It was their way of facing grief, of showing they would not accept tragedy without response, of teaching that negligence and danger would not go unchecked. Centuries later, the trial of the pig of Falaise endures. As a haunting reminder of the medieval mindset, it shows us a society that believed law must reach every corner of creation,
that even beasts were bound to the same cosmic order as man. And though its rituals strike us as bizarre, beneath them lies a familiar truth. In the face of loss, communities seek meaning. They create ceremonies, laws, and symbols to keep despair from swallowing them whole. In Falaise, in 1386, the people did what they knew. They summoned the court, they staged the trial, and they dressed a pig in the garments of man. And for a brief, terrible moment, they believed the justice had spoken, and their world was safe once more.
When we look back on the animal trials of the Middle Ages, it is tempting to see only absurdity. Pigs dragged before judges, rats summoned to court, insects formerly excommunicated. It all seems like a theater of nonsense. Yet to dismiss these acts as mere superstition is to miss the deeper truth. Beneath the strangeness lies a window into how medieval people understood the world, how they coped with fear, and how they sought order when life felt precarious and unpredictable. The Middle Ages were not an age of abundance or security. A single failed harvest could spell famine. A sudden illness could wipe out families. Fires, accidents, and raids lurked at every turn. In such a world, the margin between survival and ruin was thin. Communities needed rituals to make sense of loss, to channel anger, and to remind themselves that the universe was still governed by law, both human and divine. The trials of animals gave them exactly that, a framework for justice in a world filled with uncertainty. By treating animals as accountable, the courts reinforced the idea that no act, no misfortune, lay outside the reach of order. The rituals did more than punish, they taught. Owners were reminded to keep their beasts under control. Farmers were urged to take responsibility for their harvests. Villagers saw that even the most unlikely disruptions, whether caused by a wandering pig or a swarm of locusts, could be met with law, not blind vengeance. The process tamed not the animals, but the human response to chaos. These trials also reveal the closeness between people and animals in medieval life. Livestock was not kept at a distance, but lived in the very spaces of human communities, sharing streets and sometimes homes. With such intimacy came both reliance and danger. Animals were sources of food, labor, and survival, yet they were also unpredictable forces. By subjecting them to law, people symbolically placed them under human authority, reminding themselves that creation, however wild, could be contained within a moral order. Even the strangest rituals, the clothing of pigs in human garments, the proclamations to rats and caterpillars, were not mockery, but symbolism. They were ways of translating disaster into language the community could understand. A pig in trousers became a warning that beasts could cross into human spaces with deadly consequence. A summons to vermin became a way of saying that even the smallest creatures must respect the boundaries of the faithful. Symbolic acts gave shape to fear, making it bearable, if only for a moment. Over time, as science advanced and legal systems evolved, the need for such trials faded. Disease came to be understood, crops were protected through new methods, and responsibility shifted firmly onto human shoulders. The courts no longer summoned rats, nor clothed pigs for judgment, but the impulse behind those trials never disappeared. We still demand accountability when tragedy strikes. We still pass laws after accidents, create regulations after disasters, and build rituals, though in different forms, to reassure ourselves that order can be restored. So what seems today like madness was, for the medieval mind, a kind of sanity. It was an attempt to wrestle chaos into form, to give voice to suffering, and to make visible the belief that justice could bind even the wildest corners of creation. The animal trials were less about beasts than about people, about their endless struggle to find meaning in misfortune, and their refusal to accept a world without order. In the end, these trials stand as a mirror. They show us not how foolish the past was, but how human it has always been. Faced with fear, we create rituals.
Faced with chaos, we write laws. Faced with tragedy, we search for meaning. The medieval courtrooms of beasts remind us that in every age, mankind has reached for the same thing, a way to keep the darkness at bay, and to believe, however strangely, that justice speaks, even when the world falls silent.